Okay, here's a quick introduction to the VEX Cortex and powering it on, connecting things, making sure that the Cortex and your RobotC software are going to be connected to each other and communicating properly. So first off, this is the Cortex. You can see that you've got, these are all ports where components can plug into them. If I tilt it here so you can see the front face, we have a plug for our battery, which our battery will provide the power to the motors and servos, etc. We have an on-off switch. If I rotate it around this way, we have a USB port right here, and we'll have a USB cable connecting this to our PC. Okay. First, really, you want to make sure that this has been connected to your computer. As you can see on the screen, when you plug this into your computer for the first time, down in the lower right hand corner of your screen, and you can even hit this little up arrow to get this little quick access panel, the very first time you should see that the computer is installing a driver for this computer or for this Cortex, and you just need to let that happen. To connect it to the PC, connect the Cortex USB cable to your USB on the computer. You'll plug that in. Okay, just understand that generally if it's the first time, you're going to see a driver get installed, and you need to just sit back and wait and let that get installed. Okay, in general then, a power cycle, as we all know with computers, sometimes things don't go right and we often need to just kind of reboot, shut down, and this is to understand how to do that when we need to, or just even a proper way to turn on and turn off. Okay, from what I've researched and found, kind of the best way to power off, we'll start with everything off. To power it on, okay, and cycle this up, is step one to plug your battery in. Okay, step two is to connect the Cortex to the PC. So that'll be connected. And the last step would be to go ahead and flip the on-off switch. Okay, I'm going to wait for that right now, but that would be how to cycle it on. To cycle it off, we would repeat everything in reverse. If we had that on, we would turn it off. We would pull the Cortex out, or you can disconnect this from the computer, either way, but disconnect the orange cord on one of the two ends, and then lastly, unplug the battery. Okay? So powering that on off, make sure the driver's been installed on the PC, follow the correct order, battery, orange cord, on switch, and in reverse order to disconnect, turn off, disconnect from PC, and unplug battery. When you connect the devices to the Cortex itself, I have a little LED light here. If you notice on one side, if I can get this thing close enough that it's going to zoom or be right, but there's a notch here, if you can see this. And this notch, okay, as opposed to the other side is just square, okay, that notch is going to fit into the Cortex in these grooves. You should see these grooves along here. Okay. Now the LED is a digital component, and so it's going to go into this section here labeled digital. And because all these notches are on the right side, I need to orientate this so that that notch is on the right side. And it should actually feed into one of these notches. Now the LED only has 2 wires sticking out where there's 3 on the bottom, so you could, in theory, some students will get that flipped around and kind of be using the wrong 2 holes to plug that into. So make sure the notches line up, and that should let you know which port you've actually plugged this into. Okay. As well as here I have as an example a motor wire. Most of our motors need to be connected to the Cortex using a motor controller wire. And so the motor only has 2 plugs, which will plug into this end, and then the green end with all 3 will plug into ports 2 through 10 on the motor side. And again, make sure you have that little notch sticking out so you know which direction this goes. Okay, there's 10 numbers here and there are 10 notches. So if you're ever unsure which one it's going into or should line up with, just count. if I wanted to plug this into port 3, I would count down on that left in those notches, 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to get the notch to follow that third groove. Okay, make that, and then just kind of make sure the wires are lined up, and it should sit in there nicely. Okay, so we know how to plug things in. We know how to plug the Cortex in. The other thing with the Cortex, you may have all your wires and components plugged in, and that's fine, is often you will need to make sure the firmware is up to date. And so if we flip over to RobotC, okay, and just go back to the start page, under Robot, you should find Download Firmware. I'd go to Manually Update Firmware. Just hover over and you get the next window. Then you'll see a few options. Right now, we need to make sure the master CPU is up to date, as well as RobotC, and you want to do it in this order. The master CPU firmware, go over to Standard File and select that. You'll see a dialog box come up. It's going to take a second. It's going to download it. It's got to install it. Eventually, you should get a message saying it's successful. After you've done that, again, come back into Robot, download firmware, a manual update, do the RobotC standard file, and select that. If you've powered on your Cortex in the right order, you've done both of these firmware updates, everything should be in pretty good shape. Okay, you should be able at this point, to flip your Cortex on. Okay, you can download the firmware without this on switch, so you can flip that on. And for us, all of the files that we're going to create and use are going to be based on the Project Lead the Way template. So anytime we open a new file here, instead of choosing New File, we're going to go to File and Open a Sample Program. You'll probably have this folder open up. Inside this folder, you need to look for PLTW, Project Lead the Way. There is a PLTW natural language, but you want PLTW. Choose the PLTW template, and it opens. And this template right here already has settings adjusted that we want every time. Once you've opened this, we don't want to change the template. We want to keep that preserved as our starting point. So the very first thing will always be to go to File, Save As, in which now you can navigate to your correct documents folder to save it and to name it so that the PLTW template doesn't get changed. That is a file that will stay out there for us to use as our starting point. Okay, so when you open files, you can have more than one file open. As you can see, I have different tabs here. You can right click and close or save. You can even close all but the one selected. So you have options here to navigate between different open programs that you're working on. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close that one. I'm going to go back just to this tab, and I'm going to remind you as a last thing, things to double check in RobotC. Under the robot, after having the firmware updated, our platform type should be VEX 2.0 Cortex and natural language PLTW. Also, the VEX Cortex communication mode should include USB, whether it's on this one or USB only. Sometimes when you're troubleshooting, even though this should work, you can try putting it to USB only in case you're having some trouble. All right, so there are just some basic intros of how to power on the Cortex, how to make sure it's up to date, how to open RobotC, and have these settings right so that you are ready to go.